And ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Z Movie Podcast. A lot to talk about in this one. I am Yoko, and this is Michael.
Hey, I'm Michael.
Thank you. Thank you.
What do you want me to say?
No,
I don't know.
no. It's just
Did I deny that that's who I
no.
am?
Never deny who you are, Michael.
Add a little intrigue.
Well, if you want to plug yourself in at the base of your skull, we can jump into
Oh,
the virtual world of the Matrix. On this episode, we are going to discuss the Matrix
I
Trilogy.
thought we were talking about Swordfish, the true definitive computer
I feel
film
like
of the
Hugh Jackman
90s
and
and
Halle
2000s.
Berry aren't incredibly proud of that. I feel like John
Well,
Travolta might be proud of
John
that.
Travolta, you think is
He
proud of that
might
one?
be. I don't know. He might
He
be.
really went for
He
it, you
did.
know?
He really did. But no, we are not talking about Swordfish as Michael would have wanted,
But
but
we
we are
will.
talking about the Matrix trilogy in hype for Matrix Resurrections, which is coming out this coming Wednesday. It's pretty interesting to have a new Matrix movie almost 2 decades after the sequels. I think that's a really interesting kind of move. So, in anticipation for that movie, we want to just revisit that original trilogy starting off with The Matrix from 1999. I don't know about you, Michael, growing up, but as a kid in elementary school, this was a very controversial film amongst the parents, I remember, because I remember watching it very young at an age when I probably shouldn't have watched The Matrix. And I felt this sense of like, oh, Yoko probably shouldn't have watched this, but he did.
Oh,
Um,
no, my parents were wild.
I feel like both of our parents have a similar thing of let's just show Yoko and Michael these movies and it's fine.
Yeah, and TV shows too. I mean, so I didn't see it in theaters,
Me
obviously,
neither, me
because
neither.
but I saw it on DVD maybe a couple years after, and I rewatched it in anticipation of this episode, and like, man, there's some like deep body horror
Yeah, it's
in like,
crazy.
oh my god, the entire interrogation scene, the first one with the agents where they seal up his mouth and they put the tracker in his stomach. I was like, oh man, like I kind of like you remember things sort of like as you're revisiting them. You don't like always
Yes.
remember things, but you're starting into a scene, and I started the scene. I'm like, oh yeah, this is when this happens, and I watched it. I was like, damn, this is like.
It's really horrifying.
Yeah, and then there's kind of like a weird like there's no overt drug references or anything, but the kind of club that he goes to, I'm like, yeah, people are probably doing like ecstasy and like meth and all sorts of stuff, and there's probably a lot of unprotected sex going on at this club. Obviously, all implication,
I
but
mean, the
like,
guy he meets at the door, doesn't he say, like, mescaline or something?
oh, he does say mescaline. Yeah, the redheaded guy called
Sure,
Joy,
yeah.
which watching that again, I was like, eh, yeah,
Odd
I don't
choice
know.
there.
Yeah, weird
But
flex, but
I will say, without any hint of sarcasm, I do think that this movie on so many levels is so groundbreaking and so revolutionary, and I think that it did change a lot of the cinema landscape, and I think you can categorize not only science fiction movies, but action movies, or movies in general, from pre-Matrix to post-Matrix. I think there is a dramatic shift in how films are made and how films are structured, and especially how action is shot. But before we talk about The Matrix, just very briefly, I did want to shout out, as we did in the last episode, Blade, again.
oh, I was gonna say no. Well, hold on. You have to shout out
Dark
Dark
City.
City if you're gonna
I
shout
will say, though,
anything out, because it is.
I will say,
Yeah,
The Matrix was written before Dark City.
sure, but visually, there's a lot of
Yes, there's a lot of
borrowing.
comparisons. And,
Yeah,
Michael, actually, a lot of the sets that were used in The Matrix were borrowed from Dark City.
I did know that. I did know that. Yeah, I mean, Blade. I think for like the aesthetic of something like the leather jacket, kind of Eastern influenced action scenes, kind of.
And the techno soundtrack.
Yeah, the techno soundtrack. It is very 90s. I mean, watching it again, it is like steeped in 90s.
But it's so steeped in the 90s, yes, but there is a sense of timelessness to it.
Yeah, a lot of it does hold up. Yeah, I know a lot of it holds up. It's a really, really good film, which I know it's just kind of a basic thing to say, but the action holds up pretty well.
It's still incredible. I had the chance to watch the original movie in IMAX not that long ago, and it was mind-blowing seeing it on that giant screen, and I was just in awe of the action sequences. And you and I, Michael, talk off the podcast in private about how action movies are shot these days, and I really hate shaky cam. I'm super I get violently
Yeah,
angry.
shaky cam and quick cuts is kind of
And
like
quick
that.
cuts.
Which
I get furious when I see that.
think
So
it's just a time saver. Honestly, when you see that in movies, it's like they didn't have time to really do this properly, so they're kind of
I
cheating it.
know. But at the same time, I think in some instances it can't be excused. Like some scenes that really stick out to me that I won't mention, but some scenes do stick out. Like even with a limited amount of time, you still could have done a more impressive sequence. Even if you just held it on this shot a half a second longer, it would have made an impact. And I think a lot of action movies still haven't learned the lessons from The Matrix. And I think The Matrix has done such an incredible job at showcasing Eastern action cinema techniques and styles. Obviously, the Wachowskis were deeply looking into Eastern cinema, specifically Hong Kong kung fu movies and animes like Ghost in the Shell. Ghost in the Shell is very crucial to the making of this movie.
Hmm.
And you can tell a lot of it is inspired by Ghost in the Shell. The plugs
Yeah, the
in the back
plugs.
of your neck and the green template for all of the technology and the simulations, like that's also very classic Ghost in the Shell.
Or perhaps you should call them the Weeb
The
Kowskis.
Wachowskis.
Yeah, no, there is one thing, and I do want to talk about the action, but there is one thing about it that I suppose is a little dated,
Hmm.
and kind of makes me watching it and feel like it's a little bit stuck in the 90s, is the outlook of the world that they're rebelling against. It feels very like in the 90s, the big kind of push in a lot of these movies was like fighting against the office and fighting
Yes.
against like the suburbs and fighting against like a boring, unfulfilling life in a prosperous time, like American Beauty,
American Beauty, I was gonna
Office
say, yeah.
Space, Fight Club, which is kind of
Yes.
around that period. That's what it's fighting against. And then you look at, the post-Iraq War 2000s movies like your Dark Knights and stuff like that, and the world
It's
that
all
they're
like counterterrorism stuff.
yeah, it's fighting against not like blandness isn't the problem in movies anymore. Like it's not you're not fighting
Right.
against something that is bland. You're either fighting against something that's in the 2000s I feel like terrifying, and now in like the 2010s and the 2020s like there's a fight against like greed as the new thing. So that was the
Right.
one thing that dated it. And like when they were talking about, as long as you pay your taxes and the accountant walking down the street
Right,
and
right,
all that
right.
stuff, and I was like, yeah, Neo's life doesn't seem that bad to me. You know what I mean? It's like he's probably making good money. Like
Right.
he doesn't have like massive student debt or like inflation problems or like political riots going on in the street and stuff like that. Like he's doing okay. I don't know that he needs to escape the Matrix. Like it seems like it's
Right.
going fine. So that was just one thing watching it going through, and it was like the peak of our civilization, 1999. I'm like things seem pretty good in 1999. I'm not gonna lie. So yeah, that was the one thing where I was like, okay, that feels a little stuck. But everything else about like the overall message, I think, is the same. But just the way it's being said and the specific culture that it's kind of reacting to
Right.
isn't super recognizable anymore.
Yeah, I do agree with that sentiment, but I also do think that, especially nowadays, as we're going deeper into the 2020s, I still think that that message is even more so expanded upon by the emergence and popularity of social media.
Yeah,
I actually think that The Matrix lost relevancy, as you were saying, during that post 9/11 sort of world, but now found new relevancy with the advent of social media and more access to the internet. I feel
yeah.
like Neo's struggle in life reflects not only what we go through day to day nowadays as opposed to 10 years ago.
I get that. I think it definitely has swung back up, which is perhaps why they're making a sequel. I think definitely during like the 2000s, it wasn't really, and by 2000s, I mean like the late 2000s, like the
Late
Obama
2000s,
era.
yeah.
Basically, there were a different set of problems at the end of the Bush era. But I do think, and as much as I'm not like, I'm pretty tepid on this, both the book and the movie, Ready Player One feels like it is at least more catered
Right.
to the problems of modernity, where like the characters are escaping a different kind of despair. It's like the despair
Mhm.
of poverty and like the fact that there is less and we've kind of reached our limit. And I
Right.
think that's a feeling, not as I don't know if it's true universally, but I think that's a feeling that more strikes home with young people now, where they're,
Right.
crushed by debt, they're working, they're underemployed, or they're, whatever the case may be, they're not really living up to the dream they were promised. Whereas I think the Matrix, again, while it still does work and can work as a message, I just think the specifics of it are like it's impossible to always be of the now with anything. Anything you're going to
Of
make
course, yeah.
in 10 years, 20 years, the circumstances on the micro level are going to change. But the macro level of the Matrix is still pretty potent, I think.
Yes, I agree. And I think that even a film shot in the late 90s and released in the last year of the 90s, I still think that even after 22 years, it's still probably the most modern looking film from that year, along with Fight Club.
Yeah, Fight Club. I think I mean, especially immediately after it, I think the sort of like terrorism of it all kind of made it difficult to swallow because it is kind of like a Kaczynski esque, like McVeigh esque, like '90s reaction. But then we have a different kind of terrorism come in. So I think it still holds up, obviously, but there's maybe an element to it that hasn't aged quite.
Well, I mean more so just visually.
Oh yeah, yeah. Visually, I think for sure. And then those two are kind of a aesthetic movement, I
Yeah,
suppose.
and I think that no other film at that time, even a film like Phantom Menace, I think still holds up visually in terms of its style, its aesthetic. Because as I was watching it in IMAX not that long ago, it did look like it was shot like last week.
Oh
It
yeah,
does look very
yeah. No,
modern.
the images hold up pretty well. I actually, it's funny. I am going to touch on Phantom Menace, but later when we talk about the sequels.
Ooh, curious.
So yeah, just remind me if I forget. But I have a couple things that I mean, I don't know if we want to structure this. I want to talk about the sci-fi of it because there are a couple things that struck me rewatching. Then I want to talk about both the action and the CG. So I'm curious, like which avenue would you rather go down first?
So why don't we go to the science fiction aspects of it?
Okay, the world building, like the lore that they built in, is I think really really good,
It's phenomenal.
and
Like great world building.
I hadn't really paid. I mean, I knew the story when I was watching it as a kid and all that, and like it was all very impressed upon me. The stakes were there, but there's just a little touch where he's walking him through the desert. Morpheus is walking Neo through the desert and explaining what happened.
Right.
And I like so much because it's so unnecessary. Like this, the story could just be like Terminator style. The aliens rebelled against us and they were bad.
Right.
I like that the humans scorched the sky. Like that. That's
Yeah.
so great because it's not letting humanity off the hook. It feels like very much like you think about cause and effect, and I know causality is a big thing that they like talk about in Matrix
A
2. We'll
lot.
talk
And
about that.
it's so odd because that scene could have easily been a tell and not show sequence, but it actually does both very well because they're in the scorched earth set in that training simulation, and as Morpheus is explaining the whole backstory of what happened, you also get visual cues of the fields where people are grown. It's very visual, although the entire scene is led with dialogue. It's so visually rich and interesting and pleasing to the eye. I think a lot of what they were doing in that moment in particular was just so well done. And I don't think there are a lot of exposition scenes in science fiction movies since The Matrix that have been that visually interesting. And even from the start of that sequence, Neo wakes up in that white room and Morpheus comes out and he's talking about the origins of what happened, and he turns on that little antique TV and it jumps into the 90s. Like it's a really interesting
Hmm.
vibe.
The radiola
Yeah,
television.
exactly. And I think
Yeah.
all of that is just supporting the story that Morpheus is explaining, and even though it's all dialogue, it's still adding that visual component, which is great.
Yeah, I mean it is all technically tell, but they're kind of, I don't want to say distracting, but like they're doing something as along with the tell. Like there's
Mhm.
interesting set pieces going on and movement and like location changes, I suppose. I'm trying to think of the right word for how you describe like the landscape shifting for the
Right.
desert thing. But yeah, it keeps it interesting too. And just to go a step back about the lore they built around it, is it's nothing crazy, but it's what you'd expect, like the normal with just a step further. And there's another thing that reminded me of as we were talking about it, which is Agent Smith, because
Yes.
he could be just a program that wants to stop humans. He's a robot. Robots don't like humans. He just wants to stop them. But the fact that he feels trapped as well is just such an interesting choice because, like, obviously it's a parallel for the humans being trapped and Neo being trapped in his fake life. But the fact that he has not just a sort of occupational, it's my job to chase you and hate you. He's almost hates them and he hates the system to a degree,
Right.
which makes his motivation personal.
Yes.
It's not just like I am a cog. It's like, no, I don't like the way you smell. I don't like being stuck on this like tour of duty. Like this is his like Afghanistan or something, you know. it's just such a nice extra touch, and we don't know it until like 2/3 into the movie, and it makes the interrogation with Morpheus, and it makes his character going forward from there interesting. Where kind of like at the point where his appeal and his frighteningness might have started to decline, because like, oh, we get his deal. He just punches a lot, and he sounds like Mr.
Mr.
Anderson, and like
Anderson.
Mr. You are, a virus, that
The
kind of shit.
human beings are a disease.
Disease.
Actually, I do
Yeah.
want to touch upon that scene, and thank you for bringing it up, because that is honestly one of my favorite scenes in modern science fiction, because it's such an interesting concept that technically an organism, because he's an artificial intelligence, so to speak, is somewhat judging the human race as a virus. I think that idea is so interesting. And the way it's played out, where Smith goes like, I tried classifying your species, but you're actually not really mammals.
You're not
Not
mammals.
mammals.
Yeah.
Mammals have an equilibrium with the surrounding environment. Like, it's so
I do not like it here. I do not like green eggs and
Hey.
ham. I do not like them.
Hey everyone, if you guys want to listen to the rest of the podcast, you can head over to Apple Podcast at the link in the description below and hear the rest of our ramblings. And Michael, do you have any thoughts on our little plug there?
Great plug. Excellent plug. Even better episode of the podcast on Apple Podcasts. Check it out and keep an eye out for more stuff hitting this channel.
And subscribe. Thank you guys.